Immigration issues have been at the heart of public debate over Brexit. Indeed, it was rising concern about immigration from EU countries and its perceived impacts on the UK economy and society that motivated many people to vote to leave the EU. The UK government has been keen to respond to public concerns, and the goal of restricting EU immigration has been one of the main rationales for leaving the single market. But ending the right to free movement for EU nationals looks set to create a number of problems. Of the roughly 3.7 million EU-born nationals in the UK, around 80% are in work. And many employers have voiced serious concerns about the effect of reducing EU immigration on their businesses. Some of the most effective industries include farming, food processing, catering, tourism, domestic and cleaning services. Public services will be affected too, for example in health and social care, teaching and higher education. A hefty reduction in EU flows will therefore create quite serious labour shortages. In Scotland, there are also concerns about the demographic effects of reduced EU immigration. Scotland faces a more rapidly ageing population than the average for the rest of the UK, and it is dependent on immigration to meet its population growth targets. The Scottish Government has therefore been keen to sustain or even increase current levels of EU immigration. And it's not just a question of overall numbers. There are also serious concerns about depopulation in remote rural and coastal areas of Scotland. EU immigration has been well spread across all areas of Scotland and in some places has helped sustain local communities and businesses. So what are the likely scenarios for immigration after Brexit? Well, one scenario is that the UK might sustain free movement, potentially as a member of the European Economic Area, or alternatively, Scotland might maintain single market membership on its own, as set out in a Scottish Government paper in December 2016. But these options seem quite remote in political terms. A second scenario is for the UK to accommodate EU immigration within the existing UK immigration system. Under the points-based system in the UK, non-EU immigration for employment purposes is covered under so-called Tier 1 and Tier 2. But these are subject to caps at the moment, so we would need to see some expansion in these two tiers. And more seriously, they only cover skilled migrants. And an estimated 75% of EU immigrants wouldn't meet the current skills or salaries threshold in place for these programmes. So that brings us to the third scenario, and I think this is the most likely one. This is that new programmes will be developed for EU immigrants, and these might be based on an assessment of labour market needs in particular sectors. For example, we could see a seasonal agricultural workers scheme, perhaps a scheme for scientists and academics, a scheme for health workers, and so on. And they might accommodate preferential treatment for EU nationals, something that might potentially be part of a trade agreement. But what about lower skilled workers? This is a relatively neglected issue. Everyone likes to talk about attracting the best talent, but in most OECD countries, lower skilled immigration is typically channeled through temporary and seasonal schemes with much lower rights. And the UK government has hinted it would do something similar for lower skilled occupations after Brexit. Now, there are many problems with channeling EU immigration through these kinds of routes. The free movement framework under the EU provided generous conditions, including family rights, access to in-work tax credits and other benefits, and the flexibility to come and go, all of which made it feasible to sustain quite precarious, low-paid jobs. Now, if this framework is removed, it's difficult to see how lower-paid workers could viably eke out a life in the UK, or indeed what incentives they would have to come to the UK and Scotland. Temporary programmes can also be disruptive to local communities, encouraging churn, and they discourage the type of permanent settlement that's needed to respond to Scotland's demographic problems. So in short, the government is caught in a bind. If it is to avoid acute labour shortages and address demographic needs, it will need to sustain something quite close to current levels of EU immigration. But the government's also very aware of the political risks in doing so, especially given its continued commitment to the net migration target. It's far from clear this is what the 52% voted for.